Please don't let him sign that paper, Lena whispered, her small voice barely rising above the soft jazz playing in the ballroom. At the far end of the room, under crystal chandeliers and a glow of warm amber light, billionaire Adrian Cole paused with a pen in his hand. He turned slowly, his sharp expression narrowing as the crowd around him fell silent. Lena stood near the dessert table in a faded navy dress, one braid tied with a red ribbon, her eyes fixed on the contract in front of him. She was only 8, but she had the steady look of someone who had already noticed something no one else had. Adrian had arrived at the Mayfair Hotel expecting a routine charity dinner, the kind where people smiled for cameras and praised his company's newest foundation. The room smelled like polished wood, fresh roses, and expensive champagne, and everything about the evening felt carefully arranged. But Lena had been watching from the moment he walked in. She had seen his assistant, Mr. Blake, slide the folder onto the table. She had seen the strange way Blake kept glancing at the side door. And when the contract was opened, Lena had spotted a small mark near the bottom corner, a detail so tiny most adults would have missed it. Adrian looked at her for a long moment. "What did you say?" he asked quietly. Lena took one small step forward, keeping her hands clasped in front of her backpack. "The paper isn't right," she said. "My mom says people hide bad things inside nice-looking words." A few guests exchanged nervous smiles, thinking it was a child's imagination. But Adrian didn't laugh. Something in the girl's voice held him still. He lowered the pen and glanced at the page again. Near the final paragraph, one sentence had been added in a font so faint it almost disappeared under the light. It gave a private company access to a charitable property Adrian had never agreed to release. Across the room, Mr. Blake's smile tightened for just a second. Lena noticed that too. She had come to the dinner because her mother worked 2 floors below the ballroom and had asked her to wait near the service entrance until the shift ended. But Lena had wandered toward the music after hearing the laughter upstairs. Now, standing in the center of the ballroom, she felt every eye on her, yet she did not look away. Adrian set the contract down very slowly. His voice was calm, but the air around him changed. "Where did you learn to read a contract like this?" he asked. Lena pointed to the tiny mark on the page. "My mom teaches me to look twice when something feels wrong." Adrian studied her face, then the paper, then the assistant standing stiffly by the wall. The music had stopped. Even the servers seemed frozen. For the first time that evening, Adrian Cole was no longer the most powerful person in the room. He was the one listening. And Lena, with her small backpack and steady eyes, had just changed the entire night. Adrian did not sign. He set the pen down beside the contract and looked past Lena to the assistant near the wall. "Bring me the original draft," he said, his tone still quiet, but now edged with something colder. The assistant hesitated. A few guests shifted in their seats, and the soft clink of glasses vanished into a heavy, uneasy silence. Lena stayed still near the dessert table, her fingers resting on the strap of her small backpack. She had not meant to cause a scene. She had only noticed the odd mark on the page, a tiny change that made the agreement feel wrong in a way she could not explain. Adrian held out one hand. "Let me see that page again." When he read it a second time, his jaw tightened, not because of the wording itself, but because of what it meant. One sentence had been slipped into the final version, a sentence that would have moved full control of a family foundation out of his name and into a shell company no one in the room had ever heard of. The ballroom lights seemed brighter now, almost too bright, reflecting off the marble floor and the silver trays of untouched desserts. Adrian turned toward the assistant. "Who added this?" he asked. No answer came. The assistant kept his eyes lowered. Lena watched Adrian carefully. Even in his tailored tuxedo, even with every eye on him, he looked less like a man in control and more like someone realizing how close he had come to being fooled. Across the room, one of the attorneys reached for the contract, but Adrian lifted a hand to stop him. "No one touches anything until I understand exactly what happened." His gaze returned to Lena. "Tell me what made you look closer." Lena drew a small breath. "My mom says wrong things are often hidden in plain sight," she said. The words were too neat. The line spacing was different, and the page number was cut off at the bottom. Adrian said nothing for a moment. Then he looked at the paper again, not as a billionaire this time, but as a man who had just been saved by a child who knew how to pay attention. Somewhere near the far doors, a server quietly backed away, and the music remained off, leaving only the low murmur of the crowd. Adrian folded the contract once and placed it in his pocket. "You should not have had to be the one to catch this," he said softly. Lena shrugged, though her face had gone warm. "But I was the one who saw it." For the first time that night, a faint smile touched Adrian's mouth, not the polished kind people expected from a man like him, but something real, almost stunned. He looked toward the room again, toward the people who had been ready to move on without question. Then he faced Lena once more. "Stay where I can see you," he said. "I think this evening just became much more important than anyone realized." Adrian did not let the moment pass. He turned slightly, one hand still resting near the folded contract, and nodded toward the far side of the room. "Close the music room doors," he said, calm but firm, "and bring me the original draft from my office." The assistant moved at once, shoes whispering over the polished floor. Around them, the guests remained seated, their voices reduced to a soft, uncertain hush. Lena stood beside the dessert table, her small backpack still on both shoulders, her eyes moving from face to face as if she was trying to understand why everyone had become so still. She had not wanted attention. She had only wanted the truth to be seen. Adrian watched her for a long second. Under the warm chandelier light, she looked even younger than she had when she first spoke, but there was nothing fragile in the way she held herself now. She was steady, certain. "How did you notice it so quickly?" he asked. Lena glanced down at the tablecloth, then back up. "My aunt used to work in an office," she said. "She taught me to look at the small things. If something is copied wrong, it usually means somebody wanted people to miss it." The words landed quietly, but they changed the air in the room. Adrian's expression tightened, not with anger at her, but with a sharper kind of focus. He looked toward the assistant, who had returned with a second folder and was now standing too straight near the wall. The original pages were placed on the table. Adrian compared them line by line. The difference was clear now, plain as daylight. One line had been added. One signature block had been moved. The page numbers no longer matched. He exhaled through his nose and set both folders aside. "This was not an accident," he said. Nobody answered. A few guests lowered their eyes. Somewhere near the kitchen entrance, a glass clinked against a tray and then went still. Lena shifted her weight, then pointed gently toward the lower corner of the page. "That margin is too narrow," she said. "And this version was printed later. You can tell by the toner." Adrian looked at her again, this time with a kind of respect that needed no words. He had spent most of his life in rooms where people spoke to win, but this child was speaking to protect. He folded the page with deliberate care and slid it back into the folder. Then he looked across the room, not at the guests, but at the people who had assumed the evening would end exactly as planned. "No one leaves until I understand who changed this," he said. His voice stayed even, but the room felt colder anyway. Lena's fingers tightened lightly around her backpack strap. She had expected him to be surprised. She had not expected him to listen so completely. Adrian noticed that too. He stepped away from the table, slow and measured, and stopped only a few feet from her. "You did not just interrupt a deal," he said. "You may have prevented something far worse." Lena did not smile. She only looked up at him with those steady eyes and answered, "Then it was worth saying." For the first time that night, Adrian almost seemed to forget the room behind him. He saw only the girl in front of him, the one who had noticed what everyone else had ignored. And in that silence, the entire evening began to change. The room stayed still as Adrian Cole crossed toward the side table, every step measured, every movement controlled. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The guests had already learned that when Adrian grew quiet, the entire room seemed to lean in and listen. Lena remained beside the dessert table, her small backpack pressed gently against her side, her eyes moving from face to face as if she were counting who would tell the truth and who would not. A few seconds passed before Adrian's assistant returned with a thin folder and the original draft. The paper looked harmless in the warm light of the ballroom, but Adrian did not touch it right away. He only held his hand over the pages and studied the signatures, the dates, the missing initials, and the tiny difference in ink that had nearly gone unnoticed. Then he looked up. "This was not the version I approved," he said. His tone was calm, but the words landed hard. A murmur moved through the room like wind through tall grass. Someone near the back lowered a glass. Another guest shifted in his chair. Lena did not move. She had expected him to be angry. She had not expected him to be careful. Adrian turned slightly toward the assistant. Who had access to the file after it left my office? The assistant swallowed and glanced toward the far wall, where two members of the staff stood frozen beneath the soft gold lights. Only a few people, he said. My office, the legal desk, and the private conference room. Adrian nodded once, then looked at Lena again. And you noticed this before I did. It was not a question. Lena lifted one shoulder in a small shrug. It did not look right, she said simply. The last page was too clean. Adrian's eyes sharpened with interest. He opened the folder, turned to the final page, and held it closer to the light. There, hidden in the edge of the margin, was a faint mark where a page had been replaced and carefully pressed flat. Not enough for most people to see. Enough for a child who paid attention. He exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible over the jazz still playing in the corner. Then he closed the folder and placed it flat on the table. Everyone stays, he said. I want the legal team here. Now. Chairs shifted. A server paused mid-step. The woman who had been smiling beside him only minutes earlier suddenly looked as though the air had left the room. Adrian did not look at her. He did not look at anyone else either. His attention stayed on Lena, who stood small and steady in the center of all that polished wealth. You did the right thing, he said. And in case no one has told you that enough, you just saved this room from a very expensive mistake. Lena's lips parted slightly, but she did not smile. She only looked toward the contract, then back at him. People should know what they are agreeing to, she said. Adrian held her gaze for a long second. Something in his face changed then, something quieter than surprise and heavier than admiration. It was recognition, not of her name, of her character. Yes, he said at last. They should. Then he gestured toward a nearby chair, not as an order, but as an invitation. Sit down, Lena. I have a feeling the rest of this evening belongs to you as much as it belongs to me. The chair beside Lena was pulled out by a quiet gesture from Adrian Cole, and for a moment she only stared at it, as if expecting someone to take it away. When no one did, she sat carefully on the edge, her small backpack still resting against her knees. The room had shifted around her in a way that felt almost unreal. Crystal glasses caught the light from the chandeliers. Soft music drifted through the air, but none of it seemed as important as the silence between Lena and the man across from her. Adrian did not speak right away. He looked at the contract, then at the assistant, then back to Lena, as if making sure the whole truth was now in the open. Bring me the original file, he said at last, his voice even, and every revision after it. The assistant hesitated, then left quickly. Lena watched him go, then turned back to Adrian. The first page was changed, she said. Not the part with the numbers. The part in the middle. It makes the agreement mean something different. Adrian's jaw tightened, not with anger at her, but with the kind of calm that came before a decision. How did you notice that? He asked. Lena touched the strap of her backpack and glanced down for a second. My mom used to read every paper twice, she said. She said people hide the biggest lies in the smallest words. A few guests nearby exchanged looks. One man near the bar lowered his glass without drinking. Across the room, the woman who had been so polished and charming earlier no longer seemed certain where to stand. Adrian noticed everything, but he kept his attention on Lena. Your mother taught you well, he said. Then he folded his hands loosely on the table. And you did not just notice it. You had the courage to say something when most people would have stayed quiet. Lena lifted her chin a little. If it is wrong, she said. Even if everybody is pretending not to see it. That answer landed in the room like a small bell. Adrian leaned back slightly, studying her with a new kind of focus. The little girl in front of him was not trying to impress him. She was not asking for anything. She was simply telling the truth. When the assistant returned with a thin folder, Adrian opened it under the warm light and scanned the pages line by line. The room seemed to hold its breath. Then he stopped. There it is, he said quietly. A revised clause, buried where most people would not look. The woman by the wall went pale. A murmur spread through the guests. Adrian closed the folder with one controlled motion and looked toward Lena again. You were right, he said. And because you were right, this evening is not continuing the way anyone expected. He stood, but only enough to reach for a nearby glass of water, which he gently set in front of her. For now, he added, I want you to stay here. Safe, seen, and heard. Lena looked at the water, then at him. For the first time, her shoulders eased. Not because the room had become less dangerous, but because someone finally believed her. Adrian's gaze moved across the guests once more, and when he spoke again, his tone was no longer polite. It was final. No one leaves until I understand exactly who changed that file and why. The silence that followed was heavy, but it was no longer empty. It was the sound of truth finally entering the room. Adrian did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The room had already heard enough to understand that something serious had changed. He lifted the folder again, scanned the altered clause one more time, and then handed it to the assistant with a calmness that felt more powerful than anger. "Get me the original version, the access log, and every name that touched this file," he said. The assistant nodded quickly and moved away. Lena remained seated in the chair beside him, her hands folded around the glass of water as if it were the first steady thing she had held all evening. Adrian noticed how carefully she watched every movement in the room. He lowered himself to one knee so his face was closer to hers, not towering over her, not making her feel smaller. "You were brave to speak up," he said. "Most adults would have stayed quiet." Lena glanced down for a second, then back at him. "It did not look right," she said softly. "So I said something." A few guests nearby exchanged uneasy looks. One woman near the entrance checked her phone and then quickly lowered it, as if she had suddenly remembered she was standing in the middle of something she could not pretend not to see. Adrian's jaw tightened, but his eyes stayed on Lena. "That is exactly why this matters," he said. "You noticed what was wrong before anyone with a fancy title did." The words settled over the room like a slow, unexpected truth. A server quietly placed a small plate of fruit and crackers on the table beside Lena, and Adrian thanked him with a nod. The gesture was simple, but it made the room feel less cold. Lena picked up a strawberry, then set it down again, still unsure whether she was allowed to relax. Adrian saw that hesitation immediately. "You do not need to prove anything tonight," he said. "You already did." The assistant returned a moment later with a device in hand and a worried expression. Adrian took it, glanced at the screen, and let out a slow breath through his nose. Then he looked across the ballroom, where the polished lights, the expensive flowers, and the frozen smiles suddenly seemed very small beside the truth that had just entered the room. "Someone tried to hide this from me," he said, his voice steady but sharp now. "And someone else helped me find it." His gaze settled back on Lena, and something in his expression softened. "That makes you important," he said. "Not because you are a child in the wrong room. Because you told the truth when it would have been easier not to." Lena lifted her chin a little at that. The air around them had changed. What had started as a room full of control now felt like a place where every hidden thing was being pulled into the light, one careful step at a time. For a brief moment, no one in the ballroom seemed to know how to breathe. The music had stopped, the guests had gone quiet, and the polished room felt suspended between embarrassment and truth. Lena sat very still in the chair beside Adrian, her small hands folded in her lap, her face lifted toward the chandeliers as if she could feel the whole room shifting around her. Adrian remained beside her, not towering over her, not using the weight of his name to dominate the space, but staying close enough to make it clear that she was not alone. Across the room, the assistant who had brought the altered file had gone pale, while several members of the staff stood near the wall with rigid shoulders and eyes fixed on the floor. Adrian opened the original version of the document on the tablet in his hand and compared it line by line against the copy that had been placed before him. The difference was small enough to miss if a person were careless, but large enough to change everything if a person was dishonest. He traced the text with one finger, then lowered the tablet and looked up with the same calm expression he had worn all evening. "This was not a mistake," he said quietly. The words carried farther than a shout. "Someone changed this on purpose." A murmur moved through the guests like wind through dry grass. Lena glanced up at him, then toward the people gathered near the front of the room. Adrian noticed the look and followed it. "You saw something," he said to her, his voice gentler now. "Do not worry about saying it the perfect way. Just tell me what you noticed." Lena took a slow breath. The ballroom lights reflected in her eyes, and when she spoke, her voice was small but steady. "The folder was already open before it reached you," she said. "And the page that changed was not the only thing missing. The copy on the table had a different seal at the bottom." Adrian's jaw tightened, not with anger exactly, but with recognition. He turned to the assistant. "Bring me every version of this agreement from this afternoon," he said, "and the security log from this floor." The assistant nodded too quickly and hurried away. Adrian then glanced toward the guests again, his expression composed but unmistakably final. "Until I know who handled this file, no one is leaving with assumptions," he said. "We will do this properly." The room stayed silent, but it was a different silence now. It was the kind that comes before a door opens. Lena sat up a little straighter, as if she understood that the truth was no longer something she had only whispered into the dark. It was standing in the light. Adrian looked down at her and gave a small nod, almost like a promise. "You were right to speak," he said. "That matters." Then, after a pause, he added something that made the air around them feel warmer. "And if someone tried to hide the truth from me tonight, then you may have just saved everyone in this room from making a very bad decision." Lena blinked, surprised by how serious his tone had become, and for the first time since she had entered the ballroom, she allowed herself to sit back and breathe. Around them, the glittering evening had lost its certainty. What remained was more honest, more fragile, and somehow more hopeful. Adrian did not move away from Lena after the room settled. He stayed beside her chair, one hand resting lightly on the back of it, as if his presence alone could keep the evening from slipping into confusion again. Across the ballroom, people began to shift in small, careful ways. A man near the far wall lowered his phone. A woman in a silver dress looked down at the glass in her hand and suddenly seemed far less interested in being seen. Adrian noticed all of it, but he did not chase the room. He kept his attention where it belonged, on the truth, on the child who had spoken it first. "Bring me the original copy," he said quietly to his assistant, without looking away from Lena. "And the audit trail. All of it." His assistant nodded and hurried off, the soft click of her heels fading into the musicless air. Lena watched her go, then turned back to Adrian with a small, uncertain breath. "Will they believe me now?" she asked. It was not a pleading question. It was practical, the kind of question a child asked when she had already done the hard part and needed to know if the world was finally ready to meet her halfway. Adrian lowered himself into the chair beside her so they were eye level. "Some of them will," he said, "and the ones who do not will have to answer for that." The words were calm, but there was no weakness in them. They carried the weight of a decision. From the edge of the room, the woman who had first challenged Lena stood rigidly near the pillar, her expression carefully arranged, yet the strain in her jaw gave her away. She had expected embarrassment. She had not expected proof. Adrian lifted his gaze in her direction for one brief second, and the message was clear enough that no one needed it spoken aloud. The story was no longer under her control. Lena drew her hands together in her lap and looked toward the ceiling for a moment, where the chandeliers spilled soft gold light across the polished floor. The room still felt too large, too elegant, too full of people who had been pretending not to listen. But something gentle was taking shape inside that space now. Not comfort, exactly. Something closer to safety. Adrian turned back to Lena. "You did the right thing," he said. "I know that may not feel like much right now, but it is." Lena nodded once. Her shoulders loosened a little. The silence around them had changed again. It was no longer the silence of shock. It was the silence that comes when everyone realizes a line has been crossed, and the only honest response is to stop and look at it. A few minutes later, Adrian's assistant returned with a folder pressed close to her chest. She handed it to him, and he opened it with slow precision. For a moment, only his eyes moved as they scanned the pages. Then his expression hardened in a way that did not need anger to feel dangerous. He closed the folder and set it on the small table beside him. "There it is," he said. "The timestamp, the altered signature, the missing approval." No one spoke. The entire room seemed to lean in without moving. Adrian stood, not abruptly, but with the kind of measured control that made every person in the room feel the shift. "From this moment on," he said, his voice steady and unmistakable, "nothing here will be decided by influence, assumptions, or convenience. We are going to handle this honestly." Lena looked up at him, and for the first time that night, the fear in her face gave way to something brighter. Relief, maybe, or the beginning of trust. Adrian offered her a hand, not to pull her up, just to show her the choice was hers. After a second, she placed her small hand in his, and when she stood, the ballroom seemed to recede around them. What had begun as a room full of polished lies was becoming a place where the truth could finally breathe. By the time the room had settled into that new, uneasy honesty, Lena could feel every eye in the ballroom drifting toward her and then away again, as if even the most confident guests were no longer sure where to place their attention. Adrian remained beside her, calm and unreadable, while the folder on the table seemed to carry more weight than anything else in the room. The air had changed. It was thinner now, quieter, and somehow far more revealing. A server moved carefully along the edge of the crowd, passing untouched glasses and avoiding the center of the room, as if the truth itself had created a boundary no one wanted to cross. Lena kept her hands folded in her lap, but her posture was different now. She was no longer shrinking into the chair. She was watching. Adrian opened the folder again and looked down at the papers with a steady expression that gave nothing away. Then he glanced toward the back of the room, where a few faces had gone pale in the bright overhead light. "Someone here thought they could hide a change in the records," he said, not loudly, but clearly enough for every person to hear. They counted on silence. They counted on confusion. They counted on the fact that most people would rather look away than ask questions. No one moved. Even the soft music from the far side of the ballroom had not returned. Lena turned her head slightly and saw one of the older board members press his lips together, while another woman carefully set her glass down as though her hands had suddenly become uncertain. Adrian's gaze did not leave the room. "That ends now," he said. "If there is something to confess, this is the moment to say it. If there is something to correct, this is the moment to correct it." The words carried without force, but they still landed hard. It was not anger in his voice. It was discipline, and that was somehow more powerful. Lena looked up at him and saw something she had not expected to see so soon. He was not trying to win the room. He was trying to protect what was true inside it. That difference mattered a great deal. On the far side of the ballroom, a man in a dark suit finally stepped forward half a pace, then stopped, his face caught between fear and calculation. Adrian noticed immediately. So did Lena. The silence stretched again, but this time it was different. It was the kind of silence that comes just before a hidden thing is finally named. "Take your time," Adrian said, "but do not waste it." Those words seemed to move through the room like a final warning. Lena drew in a slow breath and felt the tension in her shoulders loosen, just a little. The whole evening had shifted from performance to reckoning, from polished smiles to plain truth. And for the first time, that truth did not feel like a threat. It felt like a door-opening dot.